We are about to take a walk through the Green Timbers Urban Forest. Here we will discover the quiet beauty of this wonderful forest. We are now at the south end of Green Timbers Lake. The forest here was totally cleared and is only now starting to grow back. Mr. Shawn Gurney, who is with us, will explain the way in which nature goes about getting the forest to grow again.
Well, as you can see, we're standing in a clearing here. We've got a dirt pathway behind us and a creek just running in front of me here. About 2 years ago, this was nothing but rock and mud. It was a fresh clearing, and you can see that the aggressive pioneer plants have already taken a hold here. You don't usually think of plants as being aggressive, but believe it or not, they are quite aggressive. This alder took hold on its own, and it's sending up new trees all over the place. This is red alder, and it's one of our most aggressive pioneer species, as I mentioned. Very hardy, already 3 years old, and it's taller than I am, which isn't saying too much, but it's saying it's a fast-growing tree. This makes way for all the new plants to grow up underneath it. It provides shade, it regulates the moisture underneath the trees, it keeps it cooler, and the new plants can come up and start forming the next layer or the next cereal stage of the forest. Now you might be wondering why it's called red alder. It looks quite green for the most part. You can see some of the younger shoots have a red tinge to them. And as these trees get older, when they're fully mature, if you were to cut one down and look at the wood, it's got a pinkish red tinge to it, a bit of a reddish color to it. Mr. Rene Saveney is going to tell you a little bit more about how alder takes hold in a new clearing and what it does to prepare the soils for the next generation of plants that come along.
Hello, I'm Rene Saveney of the White Rock and Surrey Naturalists, and we're here today to explain some of the successional stages that occur when plants reinvade a newly disturbed area. Right behind me we have a group of alders, and these are one of the pioneer trees that come into the area when it's first disturbed. Now when you pull out an alder, what many people will notice are on the roots little clumps of material that are actually nodules composed of a grouping of plant tissue, and in this case actinomycetes, which are a microorganism with fungal-like characteristics. And between the two, they have the ability to take nitrogen from the air and fix it into usable substances, particularly now for the alder trees. Because of the fact that the alders tend to grow in disturbed areas, there is usually very little nitrogen in the soil, nitrates, so it really helps to have these actinomycetes with them. The plant benefits from the nitrates, and the actinomycetes benefit because they get the carbohydrates, the sugars and starches from the plant. And between the two, they do a very, very good job of establishing the first set of plants. Now, once the alders grow up to the stage that they are behind me, they, with their leaves, tend to produce a lot of shade in the summertime, of course. And the shade allows the young seedlings, particularly of the hemlocks and little red cedars, to get started. In this time of year, when the alders have dropped or are dropping their leaves, you may have noticed that alders tend to drop their leaves when they are quite green. And this may be related to the fact that they have this nitrates in them from the actinomycetes on their roots. As a result, the leaves fall fairly close to the plant, and then when they decay, it's a natural way of putting nitrates back in the soil, rather than using artificial fertilizers, which require a lot of fossil fuels to produce. Now, as the plants grow, of course, they produce leaves, and we have some here. And in spite of the fact that they've just fallen off the trees, you notice that they are still quite green. And it is suspected that this is related to the fact that the actinomycetes do this nitrogen fixing. And when they fall to the ground, of course, and will decay and put the nitrates back into the soil in a very natural way, rather than using artificial fertilizers, which take a lot of fossil fuels to produce. We have a nature's way of doing this without anything more other than sunlight. Now, apart from providing nitrates to the soil, in the summertime with the leaves on, the alders also provide shade. And the shade allows the small seedlings of the western red cedar and the western hemlock to get started. Now, in time, when succession time goes on, these trees will grow up, they will grow taller than the alders, begin to shade out the alders, they will then die, and the forest then will consist of cedars and hemlocks, which are shade tolerant and love the wet soil. And you have reached a more finished stage of the successional process.
We'll take a walk into the forest and we'll take a look at the plant communities in that forest and how they all interact together in what's called a symbiotic relationship to create what we refer to as a dynamic ecosystem, a living system. I'd like to start by pointing out the area I'm standing right here. It's a cleared area. This was cleared by man. And what we see on the ground here is very little vegetation, if any. We see a few leaves mixed in with the gravel. Nothing growing right now. This is a very good example of a fresh cleared area. This is a maintained area. It's kept clear, but this is a good representation of what an area looks like after it's cleared. If you'll just look off to the side over here, you'll notice that we have smaller plants, different grasses, some small flowering plants starting to come up through the gravel. There's also gravel down here, but these plants are making their way into the gravel and starting to take a hold. If you'll come back onto the other side of the clearing here, we'll notice that the plants in this area have taken a good foothold. They're really getting established. They're much bigger than what we see over here. And we can take a look at a few of the prime examples here. What we have here is called a sword fern. And the sword fern is named likely because of the shape of a sword. If you look at it, each individual leaf or frond, as this is referred to, is shaped like a sword. If you look on the underside of the sword fern, you'll see all these orange dots. These are called sori. These are collections of spores, which are the reproductive parts of the fern. These spores are dispersed by wind and rain. They fall to the ground and produce new ferns. We have salmonberry here. This is another edge species. What we're talking about right now is the edge of a forest. It's the edge between the forest and the clearing. Salmonberry is a very aggressive edge species. It takes hold and reproduces rapidly throughout the edge. Another type of fern you see in here, this is called a bracken fern, one of our larger native ferns. This is a small specimen. They get much bigger than this. As you can see, this one's up to my chin, and they get a lot larger. This plant we see behind us with the beautiful pink flowers on it is called hardhack. It's another very important edge species. It's important in the fact that it provides food for insects and birds. Notice how on the top of the flower, the hardhack flower, the The blooms are becoming a little bit lighter colored, not quite as pink, and as we come down they get darker. And if you look right down here, you'll see the new flower buds starting to come out. Well, what we've taken a look at so far is a clearing in a forest and how the edge of the forest are trying to always encroach on the clearing, to close in on the clearing and start turning it back into a forest again. That's nature's way of reclaiming cleared land. What we are on here is kept clear by man, by humans. They come in and they keep it clear so they can walk up and down. So let's take a little walk down the path and we'll walk into a semi-mature coastal forest ecosystem and take a look at what that's all about. Notice all the vegetation growing on this nurse stump. You can see down below an old tree stump, pretty good size by the looks of it. On top of it here, we've got a birch tree growing. This, as you can see, is a good size in itself. Notice how the roots of the birch tree come down and wrap around the stump, and they make their way all the way down to the soil, down at the forest floor. Eventually, through time, this stump will completely disappear from underneath this tree and you'll be left with something called stilt roots. And exactly like it sounds, the tree is going to be standing on a set of stilts that are its root system. You won't see the stump anymore and it'll be pretty impressive. Also growing on here we have salal. This is a very important food supply for birds and insects and so on, small mammals in the forest. It produces a mealy, sort of not very tasty berry. Not tasty to us, that is, but as I say, very important to the birds and small mammals of the forest. Just above me here we have red huckleberry. These berries are even tasty to people. Also a very important food source for the birds and the small mammals in the forest. All growing on one stump. Well, here we go into what we refer to as a coastal temperate rainforest. This is a young coastal temperate rainforest, and as you enter the forest with me, you'll notice that a lot of things change as we walk in. It starts getting darker. That's because the sunlight's being blocked out by these giants above us. Everything starts to get cooler. That's due to a lack of sunlight. The bugs increase because they like the shady areas. The moisture in the ground is noticeably wetter ground in here. We got sort of muddy, it sticks together, it's still wet compared to what we saw out there in the gravel was nice and dry. This is the realm of the big trees, the giants, and in here we see a mix of conifers beside me and deciduous trees like we looked at out in the clearing. What you see here with the beautiful green colors and the sunlight filtering down through the leaves is vine maple. This unassuming little tree often gets overlooked in the forest simply because it is small. That doesn't mean it's any less important than any other part of the forest. In fact, the trees that you're looking at here took years and years to grow. They're just a very slow growing tree because they grow in the lower canopy of a dense mature forest or a dense closed forest. Therefore, competition for sunlight and nutrients is very high. Well, if you look around really carefully when you're in the forest, you might come across one of these magnificent plants. This is called Devil's Club. And if you see one of these, it might remind you of a tropical rainforest setting with its broad, big leaves, almost as big well, bigger than my midsection actually. Keep in mind that we are in a rainforest. This is a temperate rainforest, not tropical, just meaning it's a little bit cooler with a little bit different moisture regime that it gets. Devil's Club was revered by native peoples for its power. They believed that this plant had an amazing ability to defend itself, and they had good reason to believe that. The whole plant is covered in prickly little thorns, the branches, the main stem, all underside of the leaves, on top of the leaves. Every surface of this plant is armed and protected against animals eating it, against insect attack. If you look really carefully on the plant, you can see little ants and stuff running around between the thorns. What a great place to hide out if you're an insect. Not too many animals are going to come into this plant to try and get you for food. The native peoples of these rainforests believed, with good reason, that this plant had amazing powers of defense. They would burn parts of the stalk, and from the ashes they would make a paste. This paste would be painted on themselves to give them more power during battle. The native peoples also used this plant for many different kinds of medicines. They would take the inner bark just underneath this outer layer and boil it into a tea. They would drink that for ailments such as diabetes, intestinal problems, stomach aches, and so on. Even today, people do make a tea out of the inner bark to treat diabetes with. If you look just up on the top of the plant here, we can see a little cluster. This is where the devil's club creates its flowers and then its berries. And that's how the plant reproduces. Once the berries are produced, they drop or they're eaten by birds. Inside the berries are seeds. And when the seeds drop to the ground, the berries decompose and the seeds take root and a new devil's club will grow in the understory. We're now down on the forest floor in the very lowest part of the canopy. We've been looking at some different levels of the canopy, with the devil's club being a little higher. Down on the forest floor, we've got this little rare plant that you won't see a whole lot of. In this area, we see lots of it, and I'm being very careful not to stand on any of it because it's delicate and rare. This is called vanilla leaf. It's also called deerfoot because it's shaped a little bit like the hoof of a deer. If you see it in the mud, it looks something like that. This little plant, apparently when it's dried, has a smell like vanilla. We don't want to be picking these to determine that. Somebody's already proven that, so we'll just take their word for it that it has a little bit of a vanilla smell when it's been dried out. A beautiful plant, and this provides shelter for all the littlest of the forest creatures who are crawling around underneath here. And it protects them from the rain and gives them cover from predators. What we're looking at here is a much overlooked component of the forest ecosystem. This is an old tree that has fallen down, and it's now laying flat on the forest floor. You can still see the mound where it is, and it's slowly decomposing back into the forest. It's becoming part of the soil system again. What we see behind me here is actually an old tree stump. Now this will give you an idea of just how big the trees that used to be here before it was cleared were. You can see that it's a good size, it's a lot wider than I am, and this is a lot smaller than it was when it was first cut down. This has since decayed and fallen away in places and so on. We call this a nurse stump, and if it was a log lying on the ground, we would call it a nurse log. And I'd like you to think about why we call it a nurse log and a nurse stump. I'll explain a few features of it, and it'll start to make a little more sense, I think. What we see on here is a whole plant community taking its place on the stump. Up here we've got something called licorice fern. And you can see the roots go right back into the decaying wood here, and they're deriving nutrients from that stump and getting moisture out of there, and it's also providing a place for the fern to anchor itself to. The root of the licorice fern actually tastes like black licorice if you don't mind getting a little dirt in your mouth. I don't recommend picking too many of them because they're delicate and take a long time to grow. Down here we've got another type of fern called wood fern, again growing right in the base of the stump here. You can see its roots go right down into the wood here. 3 or 4 different kinds of mosses right in this one little area growing here. Up here we have something that's called a lichen. And a lichen is actually a relationship in itself. It is a fungus that is farming algae, and it has algae within its fungal structures, and this algae provides the fungus with nutrients, and the fungus provides a place for the algae to grow and provides it with its necessities in life. The larger plant up here, which I'll shake just so you can see, this is called false azalea. It's also called fool's huckleberry. It puts out a small berry that looks very much like a huckleberry. We don't have any berries on here right now. The reason it's called a fool's huckleberry is because it's very, very bitter, not very tasty, and you probably look like quite a fool when you eat one because your face goes all crazy from the bitterness. As well as the numerous plant species we see growing on this nurse stump, this also provides a home for a multitude of insects. You can even see a small spider web here. Spiders waiting for all the other insects that are crawling through. There's bacteria in here. Even wildlife will make its home in the holes around the base. Woodpeckers will come and peck at the rotten wood to get the bugs that are living inside there. These are very, very important parts of the forest ecosystem, and they are being recycled. This used to be a tree. We saw how alder takes hold in an open clearing. it starts to grow, and as it matures and grows into a full tree, it falls down and the recycling process starts all over again. And this is what we see going on here, is nature's recycling process.
Can you guess what this creature is? Even scientists have been confused about it for a long time. It's not an animal or a plant, but during certain times of its life, it acts a lot like each of them. This bright colored forest jelly is called a slime mold, and this particular one is a slime net. Although it looks like a single creature, it's actually a collection of individual organisms that have come together in a sort of organized community. Slime molds can move around like an animal, only very slowly, creeping over the forest floor. They feed on bacteria, fungal spores, and decaying plant matter. When food becomes scarce, the slime mold begins to act like a plant, a fungus actually. It forms reproductive structures called sporangia. These create spores, which are released into the surrounding environment and will grow into new slime molds to start the cycle all over again.
Here we can see, even on a small piece of wood, nature's recycler is hard at work. We've got bracket fungus growing right on the side of the wood here. It's anchored itself in, and it's slowly decomposing the wood beneath it to extract the nutrients and so on from that wood. Beside it, we've got other kinds of fungus growing here. A little bit of moss up here, also nature's recyclers, breaking down the wood and turning it back into the soil from which it came.
This is one of the many species of mushrooms that you can find in Green Timbers Forest. A mushroom is actually the fruiting body of a fungus. The rest of the fungus is underground and looks like a mass of tiny threads. This part of the fungus is called the mycelium and is an important forest recycler. Let's take a look at some of the plants and animals that live in Green Timbers urban forest. Look for the spotted towhee hopping around low in the forest canopy and scratching around on the ground looking for insects. Listen for its distinctive call. The industrious little black-capped chickadee can often be seen hopping around low in the forest canopy and hanging upside down looking for insects on the underside of branches. If you hear its song, you might be able to figure out why it's called a chickadee. This is the downy woodpecker. Notice the shape of its tail feathers and how stiff they look. The woodpecker uses its tail to help hold it up when it's climbing and foraging for insects on the trunks of trees. This little fella will likely be chattering a warning at you if you see him in the forest. This is our native squirrel. The big gray and black ones you see are an exotic species that compete with the Douglas squirrel for food and territory. You probably won't see this animal very often because it only comes out at night. Animals that are active at night are called nocturnal. This is the opossum. It's a marsupial, which means that it has a pouch to raise its young in, kind of like a kangaroo. This is another nocturnal animal, the raccoon. This sharp-looking forest dweller is very adaptable and can be seen searching for food in backyards and in loosely capped garbage cans. The raccoon can use its paws much like you use your hands and is known to wash its hands and food where there is fresh water available. The tiny winter wren can be seen in the forest all year round. This little bird nests in small cavities and spends most of its time close to the forest floor, scampering around looking for insects. They are very well camouflaged and can be difficult to see if they are standing still. Some people describe the song of the winter wren as sounding like a squeaky wheel that keeps turning and turning. This is the colorful and intelligent Steller's jay. This one's attempting to pry a snail from its shell by cracking it on a cedar branch. Their bright blue feathers, loud calls, and curious nature make them easy to spot. If you see one in flight, notice how its wings are shaped. The short, wide, rounded wings allow the Steller's jay to maneuver easily through the dense forest canopy. The flower bud of the bunchberry is spring-loaded. The flower opens very quickly, and as each petal snaps open, it flings its pollen into the air. Enjoy the sight of this beautiful plant, but don't eat the bright berries of the red elderberry. They look like they'd be good, but they can make you very sick. This stunning display is the flower of the skunk cabbage. Look for the plant with the huge leaves growing in wet or swampy areas. Its distinctive smell will let you know when you're getting close. This is the pretty pink flower of the salmonberry shrub. The berries of this plant are very tasty, but don't eat too many of them. Remember, the animals need to eat too. This is the rare and beautiful western trillium in bloom. Ants are attracted to the seeds of this plant. They carry the seeds away from the plant and help distribute the trilliums around the forest. If you pick the western trillium, it will die and wilt almost instantly. So please leave these where they belong, growing in the shady, cool forest floor. If you look closely, you can see where the clasping twisted stalk gets its name from. The base of each leaf is wrapped around the zigzag stalk.
Well, what we've looked at over the last little while are just a very, very few parts of the forest ecosystem. Basically, if I was the forest ecosystem, we would have just looked at about this much of it, just a pinky tip of the whole system. To understand the forest ecosystem, you have to come into it and spend a lot of time and enjoy it and immerse yourself in it. Look around. The more you look around, the more you're going to see. You can squat down in one spot in the forest and look at just that one little square foot of ground in front of you and see millions and millions of different things. And keep in mind that the forest ecosystem is all about time and time influencing change. So to come in one day and look at something doesn't mean that when you come in the next day and look at it, it'll be the same. Things will have changed, and if you look closely enough, you'll see the changes going on all around you. So come in and enjoy our ecosystems and learn from them. That's what it's all about.
We are now at this moment standing on the southern edge of the Green Timbers forestry. When I was a kid, where we are now, trees were 150 or 200 feet tall, and they reached all the way from, let's see, Happy Max, that would be on the Fraser Highway at the King George Highway, and it went all the way across to the Johnson Road. That was 152nd Street. So there was a big strip of timber with trees on both sides of the road, and there are still some pictures available with this old forest standing. Now our place was down at the end of the Archibald Road, which is now on 144th Street, and we lived at Bear Creek. The timber, when we moved into this part of the country, was in 1926. The timber had been cut down just a little bit north of the Green Timber School on 144th Street. And the trail at that time was still going through the forest, and you could pick up exactly where the punching was put in the road to keep the horses and the wagons out of the deep mud. We're looking at a blowdown here where this wind has got into the forest and knocked down a lot of these trees that we've planted. Now this is a natural sort of a thing, but you can imagine if it does this when there's guard trees, what'll it be like if there were no guard trees? If they widened 92nd Avenue, this would happen all the way along. And I'm just so thankful that the city of Surrey has decided not to widen the 92nd Avenue and cut away the trees that protect our forest. There's a tiny little bit of it. Right here is where the chopping board, where the fellows put the board in that they stood on when they felled the tree. It was too difficult to fall these trees right at the ground level because they get so wide and there's so much dirt. So what they did, they chopped a notch in the tree and put in a board to stand on, one on each side. Sometimes if the tree was very, very big, the timber wasn't a problem in those days. They didn't worry about losing a bit of timber. It was the idea of getting up a bit so that they could cut the thing off without too much work. And the notch has to be cut just the right width so that the board slips in. If it's too wide, of course it's down, and if it's not wide enough, then they can't get the thing in, you know. So it was really a tricky thing to cut that notch, and it had to be wide enough so the guys could jump on it and swing it around so that they could cut the tree all the way across.
As you can see, the fallers of the late 1920s used some very different equipment compared to our modern powerful chainsaws and heavy machinery. They cut these massive trees with heavy double-bitted axes and long crosscut saws. These saws had two handles and required a person on each end just to pull them through the wood. Falling these giants took an enormous amount of skill and effort and was very dangerous work. Despite these challenges, the loggers managed to clear the original forest and provide the Newton-based King and Ferris lumber mill with a steady supply of old-growth timber. A railway, whose path is still visible in Green Timbers, provided an effective way of transporting many logs at once. These loggers also found it to be a good way to get home after a hard day in the forest. Look into the understory here and you can see an old cedar log about 6 feet across that looks like the hull of a ship. This tree was many hundreds of years old when it was cut down, and it was one of the few large trees left on the forest floor.
I didn't help to clear the land where the forestry is, but my friends did. Fred Baker, he was the guy that blew the stumps. Harry Baker, my friend, and Tom Wells, they were all workers in the area. And Harry had a job of trying to burn all this stumps. You know, that was a real contract. But they had a contract. Billy Woods was the guy that had the contract, and he contracted to clear 6 acres or 5 acres. But he said, well, if you want 5 acres of land, you got to give me a contract for another acre to pile the stumps on, you see, because there was so much wood. It was hard to believe how many stumps and how big they are when you get them out of the ground. And they're so heavy, they're hard to move. So piling them was really very difficult. But they did burn them with, I don't know how many barrels of diesel oil they used and how many, tons of old tires that they put in to make them to burn. Anyway, they got them done. Now, after we had the clear landing done and the preparation for the seed beds in 1930, I was up there with my friends on a Saturday, and I couldn't work because I had to go to school with all the rotten luck. But anyway, that was the way it was. And during our lunch hour, we gathered together, and Mr. Pickford, he was the boss of the Green Timbers. He was the one in charge of the plantation, the planting of the trees, and the seed beds and all. That was his responsibility, and we had to work. The guys had to work in accordance with what he told them. But he said, it looks pretty futile, this planting seeds in the ground to grow a forest. And he said, but what you guys are doing is going to be something that's going to last forever. This plantation, this square mile of timber is 640 acres. It'll be there, being set aside forever. So that it's not going to be subdivided or diminished, or there won't be any roads cut through it. There won't be anything done to it, but it'll stay as it is. And in 100 years from now, he said there'll be big trees. Well, we've got 60 years, and they've got a pretty good start, I'd say. And it's just wonderful. It's too bad that the promise wasn't kept about it being set aside forever with the provincial government, but it is now the property of the Surrey Parks, and they are going to look after it, we trust. Well, this is one of the many little creeks that run through the forest. When I was a boy, we used to start at Bear Creek, and we'd run onto one of these small creeks, and we'd walk up as far as we could. And the amazing thing about it was in the summertime, there'd be all these little coho fish, little coho salmon. They'd be 2 or 3 inches long or an inch long, whatever size they happen to be. And they'd be up here. In the fall, in November, October, November, when the water came up, the salmon would be running all the way up these little creeks as far as they could go. And those things can swim in a couple inches of water without any trouble. And they go up and spawn, and they seem to want to go just as far as possible. But the other thing that's so wonderful, when the timber was here, there was water all year round, and it would run from the drainage from the forest, but there was always enough to keep that little creek going, and therefore these little fish would survive through the summer. Bear Creek was the main creek that came up here, and it was one of the main tributaries of the Serpentine River. And it joined, this Bear Creek joined the Serpentine River about a mile east of 152nd Street, and somewhere in between 72nd and 80th Street, about a mile east of 152nd. I had a water wheel at Bear Creek. I put a dam across Bear Creek, Main Creek. It was about 35, 40 feet long and 3.5 foot tall. That's as high as I could get because the bank on the one side was low. You know, there was practically no bank, but on the other side it was fine. And then I built a dam across there, and we had a boat and a diving board. And then I had a wheel, 6 foot high water wheel, 4 feet wide, and we generated electric power. In 1930, the government set aside this square mile of timber that we call the Green Timbers Forestry. And starting in 1932 was the first small plantation. The trouble was they couldn't start right away because they didn't have any trees to plant. So first of all, we cleared 6 acres in the Green Timbers, and that was where we planted the first set of seed beds where we were able to raise the trees so that we had some to plant. Well, by 1932, that's 2 years after the nursery started, we had trees. And 1933, I was one of the planters that helped to plant this particular quarter section that we are standing in now. Harry Baker, Fred Baker, Stan Powell, Oscar Anderson, Barney Gustafson. There was 3 or 4 others, Nick Antonelli, Bill Brown, and oh dear, I can't think of that other guy's name that I really wanted to think of because he was such a great guy. He kept us all laughing all the time, and we called him Tadpole Pine. That's all I'll say about him. But he was a man. He lived on the 96th Avenue and just about the Johnson Road, and he always worked on our tree planting crew. Now the surveyors had stretched out lines, rough lines, for us to follow with a flag every 100 feet or so apart, and we stretched ourselves between these lines, and there was a lineman on each side, and the rest of us, we spaced ourselves as best we could in between. So the trees are not in line. They should be sort of in line, but they are not, because it was just impossible to find a place where you could cut a hole, dig a hole without running into some roots or a stump or rotten wood. The rotten wood, we called it red pan, but you couldn't plant the trees in there. It was easy digging, but you couldn't plant trees in it because it had to be into the dirt. Now, as a result of our work of 60 years ago, or 62 or whatever it is, we got trees this high, and you can have a look at them. They're just beautiful. They look like they're nearly 60 feet high, 100 feet high. It's hard for me to tell, but this is a good example of what the trees have done since we were planted in the 1930s. Right here in front of us now, we're just looking down a little spot where we happen to get some trees in a line. Now, I don't know really how that happened. It must have been Fred Baker this must have been one of the surveyed lines, and he was able to get a good bead on it, and he's gone right along through there just about as straight as you can get. Now, those trees are really quite a height, and it really amazes how quickly that they will grow. Now, eventually, probably half of those in the natural forest would die because they will get crowded out. There's always 1 or 2 trees that will overtake the weaker ones, and they will die because of the lack of sunshine. This is wild blackberry. This is British Columbia native wild blackberry, what made the finest of jam. And they grow after a forest fire and after the forest was cut here. 2 years later, there was just nothing but these things all over. They drape all over the logs, berries by the dozens. Yeah. You could pick a water pail full of these things in an hour and a half, no problem at all. I'm standing beside one of the old stumps. This tree probably looks like, not a very big one, maybe 3 feet across. And It was cut down in probably 1928 or somewhere, about 1928 in this part of the country. And since then, it's in pretty good shape. They've still got the bark on it. There's bark here still. And where it was cut off, it's rotted down. And these are small little bushes that are growing on top of this. Those are huckleberry bushes. This is salmonberry. And there's a nut tree on there and some other things that are growing that just start the forest to regenerate itself. This is the nicest part of all this is that it's just natural. There's never anything been planted in here excepting the trees that we planted in 1930. The rest of it is all grown up. It was a real terrible mess when the forest got through with it. They ripped down all the vine maples and everything that wasn't hauled out as lumber was just for lumber. It was just chewed up and smashed. It's hard to believe how bad it was.
This closes our exploration of green timbers, and the time has come to say goodbye and thank you to Mr. John Tompson. We hope that this will help you to enjoy your walk through our forest. Now it's your turn to unlock its secrets. Enjoy.